Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Pastor Troy. I need those words you just prayed. You can grab a seat. Did you see the news? India just launched a rocket. I'm not reporting the news for you this week, but India just launched a rocket. They're going to take their first ever attempt at putting a rover on the moon's surface. It'll take a few weeks to see if this thing actually works. You know, other countries have tried this and they have failed along the way. If India is successful, it will be only the fourth country in history to put something or someone on the moon. Russia did it. Of course, we did it a whole bunch. And China, not long ago, just put something on the dark side of the moon. I don't even know why you're on the dark side of the moon. What are you doing over there, China? Because it's never, ever close to the Earth's surface, but whatever. If India pulls this one off, they'll be the fourth country ever. And India said, this is a big step for us because this is our first attempt to try to get to the point of putting somebody on the moon's surface. 54 years ago, the United States put a human being on the earth, on the moon. I wasn't alive. Most of us in this room were not alive then. But do you remember when Neil Armstrong stepped off of that lander and he made that famous statement? He said, "This is one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind." The whole world was watching. And I'm sure Armstrong was thinking, well, everybody in the world is watching what I'm saying and doing next. I got to come up with something to say. But did you ever think about this phrase? Hold on. How can a small step be a giant leap at the same time? Is it either a small step or a giant leap? And this has become one of the most well-known phrases in modern history. And what I want you to hear today is there is a small step that God asks everyone to make. This small step, it really is a giant leap at the same time. Faith is what we're talking about. Last week, we learned about the father of the faith. We learned about Abraham's father. And today, we're going to learn about Abraham's step of faith. The Bible calls him Abram at this point. And what I want you to see from the Bible with your life is that faith always, there's not a way around this, faith always asks you to take one small step, but because that step is into the unknown, it's actually a giant leap at the same time, and there's no way that you can have real faith without taking this small step. Last week, Abraham's father took a step of faith. He left his clan and he started to move. The Bible tells us that he was on his way to a land called Canaan, but he never got there. We don't know why Terah, Abraham's father, didn't make it to Canaan. He settled down in this land called Haran. Now, Haran is also the name of his son, a son that died. Chances are that Terah named this area after his dead son. That's where Abram is right now. And then God is going to ask Abram to kind of follow in his father's footsteps. But today, God is going to ask Abram, let's just call him Abe or Abraham today because his name changes in just a couple of chapters. God is going to ask Abram to take a ginormous step of faith, a step of faith that is so big that literally the rest of the Bible will talk about this. In fact, what you're going to hear from the Bible next, the very first things, many scholars will tell you the three most important verses in the Bible is what we're going to read next. Because all of the Old Testament promises are built on what we see happening in these three verses. The New Testament points back to this, and you and I can call Abraham our father because of what he did in these first few verses. So I want you to see how a small step of faith, because it's a step into the unknown, is always a giant leap. And by the way, once you take that step, God will meet you. And the next step, and the next step, and the next step after that, he will walk with you in every step along the way. But that first step, he asks you to take it into the unknown. Faith is ultimately allowing Jesus to set the journey. It's a step towards Jesus, And because you're allowing Jesus to set the journey, you're no longer calling the shots. God says, Abram, I'm going to ask you to do something that's scary, and I need you to trust me. I want you to go. Listen to what the Bible says, Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1. These first 3 verses, I believe, are the most important verses in the entire Bible because everything else will point back to what we read next. The Lord said to Abram, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house. Notice all of the stuff that I'm asking you to leave, Abram. Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and you will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all of the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you, Abram. Everybody, not just your direct descendants, but everybody on earth will be blessed because of you. God calls Abram to go, and without hesitation, God sends Abram, and Abram goes. And by the way, God is doing the exact same thing today and all through history. He's just calling his people. Would you be willing to take one small step? And I know it's scary because you don't know what happens next. Would you be willing to take that one small step? And if you will take that one small step into the unknown, I'll be there. I'll meet you in the unknown. But you're going to have to be willing to take that first step of faith. Now, don't get me wrong. There are times when God asks us to go ahead and wait on him and to trust him. Don't rush into anything. Wait on him. But the first step of faith is always the scariest, because the first step of faith is a step into the unknown. Faith must, by its very nature, go. If it doesn't go, it really isn't faith. I can't tell you the number of paratroopers and rangers that I have said in my Army career, if you don't step out of the airplane, you really don't have faith in the parachute. You can say it until you're blue in the face. You can fly around with the doors open and the green light on all day long, but you don't have faith if you don't take that step. That's the step that shows I really do believe what I'm saying about this parachute, and that's exactly what God expects of his people. Did you know that these are the words that God uses to create a people, call a people, create a nation for himself, a people for himself? Did you also know that Jesus uses the exact same words? God is creating his church here, and Jesus uses the exact same words when he's getting ready to leave earth and go back to heaven. The exact same words is his commission to his church. He says, hey, I've been with you, I've taught you, now I'm sending you, go and make disciples of all nations. Go do what I originally challenged Abram to do. You go do that. And by the way, keep in mind, you're not doing it on your own, because I am with you always, even to the end of the earth, meaning you don't go in your own strength and you don't go in your own power. I'm sending my Holy Spirit to go with you. Abram, in order for you to take this step of faith, you're going to have to leave a lot behind. Now listen, y'all. You are the firstborn son, which means you stand to inherit the family name, the family land, the family finances. Abram, you're going to have to leave your dad. You're going to have to leave your land. You're going to have to leave your inheritance. You're going to have to leave all of it. And I want you to go. But can we respect the fact that when God asks Abram to go right now, he doesn't even tell him where to go? I've thought about this passage countless times over the years. And basically what God is asking of Abram right now, I want you to just put yourself in his shoes for a second. Jeff, I want you to leave everything that's familiar, everything that's comfortable for you, and I want you to go that way. Where are we going, God? What are we going to do when we get there? I'm not even going to tell you where we're going. I'm not even going to tell you what we're going to do when we get there. Would you be willing to just take a step that way? I want to ask you, do you do what Abram does right here? Or are you the kind of person that says, hold on just a second, God, before we go anywhere, before we do anything, you're going to have to tell me exactly what's going to happen and how this is going to turn out? Or are you the person that says, God, I got to see a sign if you're going to ask me to take that kind of step of faith? Because when you're asking for all of the answers, when you're asking for a sign, really what you're doing is saying, God, I will act on facts, but I don't know that I'm willing to act on faith. And what he's asking Abram to do right now is, Abram, I'm not even going to tell you where. Pack your stuff and start walking that direction. And if you will start walking that direction, I'll meet you when you start taking that first step of faith. Listen, it's scary. I get it, it's scary. But Jesus says it this way. Anyone who is not willing to leave his mother and father, brothers and sisters, even his husband or his wife to follow me, Matthew chapter 10, is not worthy of me. He says, don't call yourself my disciple if you're not willing. I may not ask this of you, but if you aren't at least willing to leave it all and follow me, don't even fool yourself, because you can't even call yourself one of my disciples. And the Apostle Paul reminds us, Abram at this point doesn't have any children. And God is making a promise. Abram, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to make you into a great nation, and every nation on earth will be better if you will do this. Now, in his mind, I'm sure he's thinking, my wife and I are old and we don't have any children. Are you telling me, God, that we're going to have children? Well, Paul sets the record straight in Galatians chapter 3. This isn't about Isaac. This isn't about the future bloodline of Israel. Paul says there's one child coming, born into Abraham's family, and that one child, Jesus, because that child comes to the face of the earth, all peoples on earth are blessed. If you'll just take that step, Abram. When God says, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth, that is really why Two Cities Church exists. For those of you who are new, I need to explain something to you about our church and how we got started. When we first started this church, 20 people came together and we started praying for and had a passion for our city. We believed that this city had the potential to change the world. And by the way, those 20 people came from 6 different countries when we met across the street in that Burger King for the first time. We believe that because of the Fort Moore military community, this city has a chance to touch more of the world than New York City, than London, than Beijing. We can see more of the world affected for the gospel by just reaching our neighbors here and explaining the good news. Because the manpower data says that right now there are over 200,000 people from the U.S. military in 170 countries, and many of them have passed through us and our city before they went somewhere around the world. Did you know that there is one building on Fort Moore, just one building, that has every one of those countries and more inside that one building? When you take all of the world that's coming to us and how this community is coming around the world, if you just explain the good news of what Jesus has done for you to your neighbor, you really can fulfill the promise that God made to Abram. You can touch the world and you can have more of an impact here than New York City or London. But warning, faith is going to require you to bet it all. There's no amount of faith without risk. Faith risks it all on Jesus. And when you risk it all on Jesus, Jesus shows up and Jesus will step in and Jesus will meet you. But every one of you in this room knows somebody who would call themselves spiritual. Meaning, I have some beliefs that I agree with. There is a big difference between spiritual and living by real faith. And the big difference is what you're betting on, not what you're believing on. You see, faith always bets on what you believe on. Spiritual people sit back and say, hey, I tend to think that these facts are true. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not knocking being spiritual, but being spiritual is a great start. It's just not good enough. You have to take what you believe to be true, and you have to bet on it. We don't know the flash to bang between Genesis 12, verse 3 and verse 4. All we know is God says, Abram, I got a challenge for you, buddy. I want you to grab everything, and I want you to start walking that direction. And if you will do that, I'll meet you and tell you what's going to happen next. And look at what he does, starting in verse 4. So Abram went. Maybe it was a week, maybe it was a month, maybe it took a year for him to pray about this, to figure this out. But eventually, he grabbed his stuff and he went as the Lord told him. And Lot went with him. That's going to become important in the next chapter. Abram was 75 years old. For anybody out there who's feeling like you got a couple of miles on you, keep in mind, he didn't even start his journey with Jesus until he was 75 years old. When he left Haran, he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all of the possessions that they had accumulated, which means this guy has a lot holding him back, and all the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. Now, would you say that word Canaan out loud? That's the original destination for his dad. His dad never makes it. But apparently, Canaan is a pretty important location because of what it says next. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem. This is a very specific place where you enter the land of Canaan. A couple of you in this room have stood at the very gate where Abram walked through into the site of Shechem and into the land of Canaan. He entered at the oak of Moreh. And here's the deal. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Duh, it's called Canaan. It makes sense that there are Canaanites in the land until you recognize that these Canaanites are no friends of Abram. That Abram is actually being asked to go into enemy territory when God asks him to get up, leave everything behind, and to go. And you can't live in fear and walk in faith at the same time. Abram understood the significance of what God is asking when God told him where he was going. And this would have terrified anybody in this room. You want me to do what, God? You want me to leave everything that's familiar, everything that's comfortable for me, and you want me to go into a land where they hate me and they would rather see me dead than alive, and I've got nobody there to protect me? Why would you ask something like that of me, God? Abram doesn't even understand why he's being asked this. Fear is always going to ask you to stay, because fear is always attached to the unknown. If I go do this, I don't know what's going to happen next, and whatever it is, it's very scary because I don't know how it's going to turn out. So fear challenges you to stay. Some of you are wrestling with real fears right now because of the unknown. Faith asks you to step. Fear and faith cannot happen at the same time. Either you stay or you take that small step. And when you decide to take that small step in spite of the fear, it really does become a giant leap of faith. That's what we see Abram doing today. He's 75 years old, y'all, and he's got a lot holding him back. He's got animals, he's got property, he's got possessions, he's got a bunch of people that are looking to him as his boss. When God asks him, Abram, pack everything up, and I want you to start walking that way into the desert. And now that you've started walking, I'll tell you where we're going, and it's not going to be easy. But Abram, if you'll trust me, I'm going to meet you in the desert. I'm going to bless you in the desert. And actually what I'm going to do, Abram, is I'm going to use you to bless all other peoples on the earth. if you will just pack everything else up and go. And Abram is courageous enough to go. Between the time that God says go and the time that Abram leaves, we don't know, but the Bible kind of gives us the indication that he didn't hesitate, that he just grabbed it all. And can you imagine in the room, guys, what the conversation with your wife would have been like when you're just grabbing stuff and going and you don't even know where we're going right now? Can you imagine how that car ride would go? And Abram packs everything else up and he goes. And many of you are probably thinking to yourself, well, if God would speak to me like he spoke to Abram, then I would go. How many of you in this room would say, if he would do that for me, then I would do what Abram's doing? Go ahead. Show me your hands. Gotcha. Because at this point, all we know is that God is speaking to Abram's heart. He's not asking for a sign. He's not even asking God to show him all of the journey and the destination and how things are going to turn out. God is just touching Abram's heart and saying, Abram, I'm calling you out, and I want you to take that first step. And I am absolutely convinced that God is still doing that with every single son or daughter who he's calling into his family. He's speaking to their heart, and he's calling them to take that step. And it's scary because you don't know how it's going to turn out. And that first step really is betting it all, risking it all on Jesus. Jesus, if you're not real, then I just made the biggest mistake of my life. In fact, the New Testament puts it this way. If Jesus isn't real and the resurrection didn't happen, then we are the most stupid people. Jeff's translation, we are the stupidest people on earth for taking this step. But if he's real, and if it happened, then that changes everything. And God is saying, Abram, I'm asking you, would you take that step? And I'll meet you in the desert. And I'll tell you where we're going if you will take that first step. If you'll just listen to me, if you'll take that first step. And ultimately, faith is deciding, I don't get to set the path for my life anymore. Jesus gets to decide what my future looks like. Jesus gets to call the shots. Jesus gets to determine my path. Faith demands following Jesus' path for your life, not your path for yourself. Because here's what the Bible shows us next. God says, Abram, I'm asking you to go. And he went. He doesn't even tell him where he's going. When Abram takes the first small step of faith, it becomes a giant leap because God says, here's where we're going, Abram. We're going into enemy territory. We're going to Canaan. And only after Abram starts his journey, actually after he gets into this land of Canaan, this enemy territory, look what happens next. God shows up in that land and meets Abram face to face. The Lord appeared to Abram. I asked you, how many of you would be willing to go if God would speak to you the way that he spoke to Abram? Well, he does speak to us the exact same way, to our hearts. And then when you take that first step, that's when he starts to show himself in very powerful ways. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, meaning you are going to have children, Abram, to your offspring, singular, I will give this land. So here's what he does. He builds an altar. Abram built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him in Shechem. And from there he moved to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He built an altar to the Lord there. And he called on the name of the Lord. And then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. And in those stages, whenever he stopped, he built an altar. You should be asking right now, like, what's the deal with the altar? Why are you stopping to build altars all along the way, Abram? Well, back in the day, you would pile a bunch of rocks together, and those rocks would become a place where you would sacrifice an animal. This is your way of honoring God. Abram would pile these rocks up, and he'd spill an animal's blood on that altar. This is a site of worship. But it's more than that, because for the rest of generations, people walk by, and they're going to see that pile of rocks with blood on it. And this is actually Abram's way of claiming territory for God. God said this land is going to belong to my family in the future. So I start in Shechem in the north. I move to Bethel in the middle of the country. And then I eventually end up in the southern part of the country in the Negev, building altars along the way so that everybody knows this means this land belongs to God. This land belongs to God's people. It's the same reason why people put a memento at the top of Mount Everest, or they plant a flag on the moon's surface to say, we were here and this land has been conquered. In Abram's case, he is conquering the land for God and his future generations, for the future family that will come after him. And Abram wants everybody to know that my family are going to worship God. This is the moment where God shows up. But can I remind you, it's only after Abram has taken a huge leap of faith. He says, Abram, pack up your stuff. I want you to go. I'm not even going to tell you where yet. I just want you to go. And Abram packs up and he goes. When he goes, then God says, Abram, let me tell you where we're going. And when he tells him where, Abram gets up and starts to move into unfamiliar, unfriendly territory, literally leaves his comfort zone to go follow Jesus. And while he's in the promised land, that's when God shows up. That's when God meets him, and that's when God delivers this great promise to Abram. Now, here's the deal, folks. I see the t-shirts, I read the bumper stickers, you do too, that famous #blessed. How many of you would say, man, I want God to bless me like he blessed Abram? It's okay to admit it out loud. Go ahead, say it. Okay, one person in this room. God blesses people for a specific reason. And God always blesses his people so that they can bless others. And warning, most of the time, God's blessing is beautiful. It is awesome. You will never, ever regret the fact that God is blessing you. But at the exact same time, it can be a burden. It can be a huge responsibility. Because for the rest of your life, Abram, you're going to have to leave the houses and the land and the inheritance. And you're going to live as a foreigner. And you're going to dwell in tents. And you're never going to have what your relatives will have back in Haran. In fact, it'll be 400 years before your children actually get this land that I'm delivering to you. But Abram, if you'll follow me, man, I will do something through you. Not just something in you, but I will do something through you that is so amazing, people will still be talking about this 4,000 years later. If you would be willing to take that first small step, people will talk about your name for thousands of years later all over the earth's surface. And I am convinced God still blesses people. We just have this sometimes distorted view, like God is going to make me comfortable and he's going to make me happy and he's going to make my life easy. That's when I'm blessed. Well, he might make you happy, but the comfortable and the easy might not come with it at the same time. In fact, oftentimes God blesses you so that you could pour yourself out. And all that you're pouring out, you're giving to other people. That's what you see over and over again in the Bible when the Bible uses this word blessed. And what God is calling people to do is to step into the unknown. And it's scary. Back in 2006, I was the chaplain at 2nd Ranger Battalion, and we had been gone repeatedly. I mean, it didn't let up. We deployed as a unit to Iraq, came back and turned around and deployed to Afghanistan. We came back and went to Iraq, back to Afghanistan. This pace was brutal. And just when you were getting a break and the whole unit was on vacation, I get a phone call a week into a 2-week vacation saying, stop what you're doing, get back here because we're sending you right back to Afghanistan. And this was rough on everybody. 2 of the 4 commanders in my battalion came to me as their chaplain. And they said, Jeff, I need some advice from you. Now, you need to understand that these guys are the top 1% of the top 1% in the Army. Literally, every measure that you use to track who's going to make it to the top in the Army, these guys were blowing all of those measures out of the water. And 2 of the 4 came to me at the same time in the unit and said, I'm thinking about getting out of the Army. And I said, why are you thinking about this and what's motivating you? And they're saying that the process of staying in this unit, in this intense pace, just staying in the Army right now at this point is asking too much of my family, and I'm afraid that I'm going to lose my family if I don't leave the Army. I'm sure they were expecting some wise words of advice. But it took me about 0.5 seconds to say, well, then leave the Army. And they stopped, and they both of them took a step back, and they're like, yeah, but. And I'm like, why are you yeah, butting me? You just asked, what do I think? I'm giving you what I think. And here's what they said next. What if, and then they started playing all of these scenarios out loud to me. I'll never forget this conversation with these 2 guys because I'm standing there looking at literally some of the most talented leaders on the planet. It doesn't matter where they go next. You're going to be wildly successful. You're going to fly through the ranks. You're going to get incredible promotions. There's no holding you back. Why are you so scared? I'll just say this word. Why are you so scared of leaving the Army to go do something different if it will mean saving your family? Do you want to know the answer to the question? I already knew before I asked them. Because everything outside of the Army is unknown. Everything inside of the Army is familiar. It's brutal. I don't even know if I can keep doing it, but at least I know what I'm getting into in uniform. If I leave the Army, I don't know what happens next. And these big, tough, talented, incredibly smart leaders were basically looking at me and saying, I'm scared. I'm scared to take the step because I don't know what's going to happen if I take that step. And that's exactly what a step of faith asks you to do. It asks you to step in to a scenario that you don't know exactly what's going to happen next. Can I just remind you, if you knew exactly how it was going to turn out, is it faith? I think you missed a chance to say this out loud. If you know exactly what's going to happen next without any doubt, is that really faith? No, faith by its very nature says, I don't know. And it's scary because I don't know. If I take this small step, what if? And faith is always scary. And I'm looking at these 2 incredibly talented leaders, and it takes me about 0.5 seconds to say, then leave the Army. Save your family. And by the way, I know you well enough, I don't even need to know what the future happens. I know how this thing is going to turn out. I've stayed in touch with one of those guys. He has become incredibly, wildly successful. And I've had a chance to see him and his family a couple of times, and I was thinking, of course you would. Yeah, anybody would love to get their hooks into a leader like you. You see, Jesus is challenging people. Would you be willing to bet it all on me? And for some of you out there, Jesus may be challenging you to do this for the first time. This last statement on the screen, to start this step of faith, to basically say, I'm going to declare today that I am no longer God, and I no longer get to call the shots in my life. I am going to allow Him to be God, Him to call the shots, Him to direct the path, and I will readily admit that's scary. But if you do that, He will meet you right after you take that first step, and He will walk with you every step after that. But for all the rest of us in this room, let's just be honest. It's tempting. It's easy to stay where we're comfortable and to hang on to what's known instead of continuing to walk by faith into the unknown, continuing to do today what God asked Abram to do. The challenge is you can't hang on to familiar and have faith at the same time. You can't stay where you're comfortable and step out on faith at the same time. So I'm going to pray for us. And God knows I need this prayer like you might need this prayer. I'm going to pray for somebody to take the first step of faith. I'm going to pray for others of us to take another step of faith today. Would you just bow your heads? Would you just let me pray over us right now? Father,